Ethan had always dreamed of a quiet life in the suburbs, away from the chaos of the city. When he finally closed on a charming two-story home nestled in a seemingly peaceful HOA-governed neighborhood, it felt like the reward he'd been working toward for years. The house had everything he wanted: a spacious backyard for his dog Baxter, friendly neighbors, and a sense of community. Or so he thought. After moving in and settling down, Ethan realized the only thing missing was a bit of privacy. His backyard, though beautiful, was exposed to the walking path just behind the property. Joggers, dog walkers, and nosy neighbors could all see into his yard at any time. Not ideal for someone who valued his peace. After reviewing the local zoning laws and speaking to the city's code enforcement office, Ethan got the green light to install a 6-foot wooden privacy fence. He chose a classic design, nothing flashy, nothing extravagant. Just a simple fence to create a sense of separation between his personal space and the outside world. Within a week, the fence was up. The wood was fresh and clean, the craftsmanship solid. Ethan stood back and admired the work, feeling a sense of accomplishment. That evening, he grilled burgers in his backyard with Baxter lounging nearby, finally enjoying the kind of serene environment he'd envisioned when buying the place. But tranquility has a short shelf life in some HOA neighborhoods. And by the next morning, Ethan's mailbox had an envelope with the HOA logo on it. The letter inside, written in overly formal and accusatory language, informed him that his fence was in violation of the HOA's Community Aesthetic Guidelines. The author, Karen Thompson, the HOA president. Karen was a well-known figure in the neighborhood, tall, tightly wound, and always clutching a clipboard as if it were an extension of her soul. Ethan had only met her once during a brief introduction, and even then, he'd sensed a certain intensity lurking just beneath her polite exterior. The letter claimed that the fence was incompatible with the architectural integrity of the neighborhood and gave Ethan 10 days to remove it or face daily fines. Ethan reread the letter several times in disbelief. The wording was vague and oddly emotional for what should have been a simple guideline citation. More importantly, it didn't align with the city codes he had followed to the letter. Confused, he pulled out the HOA handbook he received upon closing. Nowhere did it mention any specific fencing requirements beyond maintaining community standards. Ethan decided to reach out directly. He emailed Karen, explaining that he had received city approval and asking for clarification on the alleged violation. The response was swift and cold. Karen reiterated that approval from the city does not override the HOA's authority, and that the matter was closed. Not one to be bullied, Ethan replied with a polite but firm message, stating that he would not remove the fence unless provided with specific policy violations. The next day, as Ethan watered his backyard plants, he heard someone call out. Turning, he saw Karen standing on the walking path just behind his fence, arms folded. She launched into a heated lecture about how his fence was an insult to the spirit of the community, and that it gave off an unneighborly tone. Her voice carried, drawing the attention of several nearby residents. Ethan, stunned at the public ambush, calmly asked her to leave his property and close the gate. As he walked back inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The fence wasn't just wood and nails anymore. It had become a line in the sand, and on the other side stood Karen. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. The day after her confrontation with Ethan, she began her campaign with an intensity that surprised even her closest allies on the HOA board. To her, Ethan's fence wasn't just a minor design choice. It was a symbol of rebellion, of someone daring to challenge her long-standing control over the community. And Karen didn't take kindly to challenges. Within 48 hours, Ethan received his second violation letter. This time, the language was even stronger. The fence was now labeled a potential hazard to pedestrian visibility and a safety concern for children in the neighborhood. Ethan blinked at the absurdity. His fence didn't even border the sidewalk. It was entirely within his backyard. Still, The letter threatened escalating fines and the possibility of legal action through the HOA's attorney. What started as a disagreement over aesthetics was now being painted as a matter of public safety. Ethan realized this wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was personal. Karen had zeroed in on him like a hawk. She began showing up near his property at odd hours, sometimes just standing across the street, taking photos with her phone. One morning, Ethan caught her measuring the height of his fence with a tape measure while muttering to herself. When confronted, she claimed she was just doing her duty as HOA president. Word began to spread around the neighborhood. At first, most neighbors stayed quiet. Many had already had run-ins with Karen in the past and preferred to keep their heads down. But a few brave souls began to show subtle signs of support. One neighbor, Dave from across the street, gave Ethan a sympathetic nod and muttered, "She did the same to us when we put in our stone walkway." Another neighbor, Maria, whispered during a chance encounter at the mailbox, "Don't let her push you. She thinks she owns this place." Karen wasn't just using letters. She brought the matter up during the monthly HOA meeting, which Ethan attended out of curiosity and a desire to defend himself. As soon as the meeting opened, Karen launched into a dramatic monologue about the deterioration of neighborhood values, complete with a PowerPoint presentation featuring photos of Ethan's fence with ominous red circles and arrows. She claimed that if one person was allowed to put up such a fence, the whole neighborhood would soon be a mishmash of conflicting styles and unchecked hazards. She framed herself as a protector, someone saving the community from sliding into chaos. When Ethan was allowed to speak, he calmly presented his case. He shared the city-approved permit, read excerpts from the HOA's own handbook, and pointed out that his fence didn't obstruct any public pathways or utilities. He even offered to stain the fence a more neutral color if that was genuinely the concern. But Karen was unmoved. She countered with vague terms like community atmosphere and visual harmony, insisting that even if it wasn't written down, the fence went against the spirit of the neighborhood. The rest of the board remained quiet, clearly uncomfortable. Some nodded half-heartedly at Karen's speech, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Ethan left the meeting realizing that although the truth was on his side, Karen's influence ran deep. Over the next few days, the conflict began to take a toll. Ethan received yet another warning letter, this one accusing him of harboring a combative attitude and disregarding community feedback. Karen started calling other board members at odd hours, urging them to take a stand before the community falls apart. The pressure was building. Ethan knew that something had to give, and soon. But he hadn't yet realized just how far Karen was willing to go to prove her point. She wasn't just aiming to win a petty argument. She was waging a one-woman war for control. And in her mind, Ethan's fence was the front line. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon when things took an unexpected turn from petty to outright absurd. Ethan had just returned from walking Baxter when he noticed a police cruiser slowly rolling down the street. Then another, and another. Within moments, 3 patrol cars were parked outside his home, their lights flashing silently, attracting the attention of nearly every neighbor within view. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, and phones were pulled out to record the sudden scene. Ethan stood frozen on his driveway, trying to comprehend what was happening. A tall officer approached him calmly, asking if he was the homeowner. When Ethan confirmed, the officer's tone remained professional but cautious. "We received a call about a possible safety concern involving a structure on the property," he said. Ethan blinked, confused, before realizing what this was about. "Is this about the fence?" he asked. The officer nodded. "We have to follow up on any reports made through 911, sir. Can we take a look?" Ethan gestured toward the backyard, still stunned. As the officers walked around the house, Karen suddenly appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, storming up the sidewalk with papers in hand. Her face was red, her steps furious. "That's the fence," she shouted. "That's the one I told you about. It's a danger to the children." He built it without proper oversight. One of the officers turned to her, calmly asking for clarification. Karen rattled off a string of wild accusations, how the fence was built with bad intentions, how it could be harboring unauthorized storage, and how it blocked visibility for emergency vehicles. She even suggested, without a shred of evidence, that it might attract criminal activity, since it shielded the backyard from public view. Ethan stood back and watched in disbelief. It wasn't just exaggeration, it was paranoia. The officers inspected the fence quietly, noting that it was stable, properly installed, and nowhere near any public easement or safety hazard. One officer, clearly frustrated, turned to Karen and asked, "Ma'am, are there any actual crimes or emergencies you're reporting here, or is this a dispute with your HOA?" Karen stammered, clearly not expecting pushback. "It's a threat to the whole community." By now, a small crowd had gathered across the street. Neighbors watched silently, some whispering to one another. A few were openly filming. Ethan noticed that even some of Karen's usual allies were watching her with uneasy expressions. The lead officer returned to Ethan and quietly said, "There's nothing illegal about your fence. We'll be filing this as a false report unless there's new information. I'd suggest you document everything going forward." Karen, now realizing that her theatrics had backfired, tried to salvage the situation by claiming she only called out of concern, but the damage was done. Her credibility, once rock solid in the eyes of the community, now seemed riddled with cracks. After the police left, Ethan was left standing in his driveway, the neighborhood's eyes still on him. One of the neighbors, a middle-aged woman from 2 doors down, approached him hesitantly. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "This is ridiculous. You didn't deserve that." Others murmured their agreement as they dispersed, shaking their heads. Later that evening, Ethan sat on his porch, processing the bizarre chain of events. What should have been a peaceful improvement to his home had turned into a public spectacle, complete with police lights and neighborhood drama. But amidst the chaos, one thing became clear. Karen had overplayed her hand. What she had hoped would humiliate Ethan had instead started to turn public sentiment against her. And while he didn't know it yet, the tide of the battle was beginning to shift. Ethan wasn't one to back down, especially not when common sense and legality were on his side. After the police incident, something inside him shifted. What had started as a simple home improvement project had turned into a relentless attack on his rights as a homeowner. Karen had escalated things beyond reason, and now it was Ethan's turn to take control of the situation. He began documenting every interaction, emails, letters, even photos of Karen skulking around the property with her clipboard. If this was going to become a war, he would fight with facts and evidence. He visited City Hall again to collect copies of the permits he'd been granted and consulted a local property attorney about his rights under both city regulations and HOA guidelines. The attorney, a seasoned man named Rick, reviewed the case and raised an eyebrow when he read through Karen's letters. "This is a textbook example of HOA abuse of power," he said. "If they try to fine you again or escalate, we can file for harassment and overreach." Armed with legal advice and growing community support, Ethan requested to speak at the next HOA board meeting. This time, he came prepared with printed documents, charts, and even a slideshow of other fences within the neighborhood that matched or exceeded the height and design of his own, many of which had never been challenged by the HOA. When the meeting began, Karen sat stiffly at the head of the table, pretending to look unbothered. But her eyes darted anxiously as Ethan began to speak. He laid out everything clearly and methodically. He explained how he had followed every legal step, acquired all necessary permits, and how no rule in the HOA handbook explicitly prohibited his fence. Then he addressed the pattern of behavior, multiple letters, false claims, and the humiliating 911 call. He pointed out that calling the police under false pretenses not only wasted taxpayer resources, but also could have endangered him if the officers had misread the situation. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of steady resolve that couldn't be dismissed. The room was silent when he finished. For the first time, Karen didn't speak immediately. She sat frozen, her mouth pressed into a tight line. When she finally responded, she did so with an edge of desperation, claiming Ethan had misinterpreted her intentions and that she was only acting in the best interest of the community. But the tone had shifted. Even some of the board members who once nodded along with her looked visibly uncomfortable now. One board member, a younger woman named Talia, spoke up. "Karen, with all due respect, it feels like this situation has gotten out of control. I've read the rules. There's nothing that says Ethan can't have that fence." Another member added, "And calling the police? That was a serious overstep. We're here to manage the neighborhood, not micromanage it." Karen attempted to defend her actions, but the room had already turned. The other residents who had come to observe the meeting, some of whom had previously been silent, began murmuring, in agreement with Ethan. A few even spoke up, sharing their own stories of petty infractions and unnecessary citations from Karen. It became evident that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Ethan, shaking his hand and thanking him for standing up. One elderly gentleman smiled and said, "We've needed someone like you around here for a long time." The sense of isolation Ethan had once felt was gone. People were finally speaking up, not just for him, but for themselves. Karen walked out of the meeting without saying a word, her usual confidence noticeably deflated. Ethan knew the fight wasn't quite over yet, but the balance had shifted. He had stood his ground, and the community had taken notice. What had once been a quiet neighborhood ruled by fear and formality was starting to change, and it was happening because one man decided a simple wooden fence was worth defending. The hearing was scheduled 2 weeks after the contentious HOA meeting, and by then, the entire neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. For the first time in years, residents had begun to speak openly about the way the HOA was run, more specifically, about how Karen had run it. Ethan's fence had become more than a home improvement. It had become a symbol of standing up to unchecked authority. And now, the outcome of the hearing would determine whether reason or control would win out. On the day of the hearing, Ethan arrived early with his attorney Rick by his side. They had prepared thoroughly, organizing every document, every email, every photo, and every violation letter in chronological order. The HOA board sat at the long conference table inside the clubhouse, their expressions sober. Karen was present too, but the confident smirk she once wore had been replaced by a thin, tight-lipped stare. She looked more like someone trying to preserve power than someone trying to protect a community. The hearing opened with formalities before turning the floor over to Ethan. He presented his case calmly, reiterating how he had sought and received all required city permits, how no rule in the HOA bylaws prohibited his fence, and how Karen had acted with personal bias rather than objective enforcement. Rick followed with a legal summary, pointing out that Karen's actions bordered on harassment and abuse of position, especially considering the false police report. He stated plainly that if necessary, they were prepared to file a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory board and seek legal restitution for emotional distress and defamation. Karen was given a chance to respond, and her tone was noticeably subdued. She claimed that her only concern had been consistency, stating that fences of that style would change the feel of the community and potentially lower property values. But when she was asked by the board to present comparable examples or documented community feedback, she had nothing substantial, only personal opinion and vague, subjective concerns. The board deliberated privately for over 30 minutes. During that time, Ethan stepped outside with Rick. A few neighbors who had come to observe approached to offer quiet encouragement. Some even admitted they wished they'd pushed back on Karen sooner. One said, "You did what the rest of us were too intimidated to do. No matter what happens, thank you." When the board returned, the decision was read aloud. The fence, they stated, was in compliance with all city and HOA regulations. No fines would be issued. All previous violations related to the fence were to be dismissed and removed from Ethan's homeowner record. But that wasn't all. After reviewing Karen's conduct, the board had decided to issue a formal censure, a disciplinary action that would remove her from her position as president and bar her from future leadership roles for 2 years. A quiet gasp swept through the room. Karen's face went pale, and she sat rigid, hands clenched in her lap. She didn't argue. She didn't storm out. She simply stood up, gathered her papers, and walked out without looking at anyone. The neighborhood felt different in the weeks that followed. Lighter, more open. Neighbors who had rarely spoken began chatting at mailboxes, waving more freely, even inviting Ethan over for barbecues and neighborhood gatherings. Karen remained in the community, but was no longer a looming presence. Without her iron grip, the HOA began focusing on real issues, fixing the aging park fence, discussing landscaping improvements, and actually listening to resident concerns. As for Ethan, he planted a row of flowering shrubs along the base of his fence, not to hide it, but to celebrate it. Baxter would sit beside him in the yard, tail wagging, as children passed by on the walking path behind them, no longer avoiding the yard with the dangerous fence, but smiling and waving at the man who reminded them that no one, not even an HOA president, was above accountability.